Walter Cronkite reporting from Pearl Harbor. This is the story of a spy. 20 years ago, on December 7th, 1941, in this famous harbor, the Japanese struck in a devastating surprise attack that for the United States began World War II. The events leading up to that attack provide an incredible story of Japanese espionage. This man spied on Pearl Harbor. His name is Takeo Yoshikawa. Today, we have brought him back to Pearl Harbor to tell his story.
In 1941, from March until the bomb fell in December, I was on the staff of Japanese consulate in Honolulu. I was not a diplomat. I was a Navy officer. And I was a spy sent by the Japanese Imperial Navy. During those few months, in a way, I held history in the palm of my hand.
Our story begins with an arrival in Honolulu and the return of a spy. Aboard this jet from Tokyo is a man who has not seen this island for 20 years. His last view came a few weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an attack he helped make possible. Then he was sailing off to an internment camp in the United States and a quick repatriation to Japan, a prisoner of the American government, in custody as an enemy diplomat, not as a spy. He spent the war years in Tokyo in naval intelligence. He is a slight, plain man, pleasant enough, although occasionally quick-tempered, a devout Zen Buddhist, married, father of two. His present business is running a gas station in Japan. He returns to Pearl Harbor to relive his moment in history. We took Yoshikawa back to a vastly different Pearl Harbor. Today's mobile fleet, constantly on the prowl, comes here only infrequently now. We approached the Arizona Memorial, where more than 1,100 men lie buried with the sunken battleship. We put the camera on him and said nothing. Later we asked, "Do you feel sad, ashamed of being a spy?" "Ashamed? No," he said. "I was a Navy officer under orders. I could not disobey. Sad, yes. Sad for all those who died here in the war, American and Japanese." We thought, as Yoshikawa walked through the great base, how swiftly history moves in the 20th century. For there, nested among the American ships, were 4 destroyers flying another flag, one that seemed bizarre and out of place here, the Rising Sun. 4 destroyers of the Japanese Navy on a training cruise to Pearl Harbor. The world has moved, but there are still scars at Pearl Harbor. Hickam Field, the bullet-riddled headquarters building. Of December 7th, naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison has written, "Never in modern history was a war begun with so smashing a victory. Never in recorded history did the initial victor pay so dearly for his calculated treachery." On Aiea Heights, whose commanding views he knew so well, over which his country's plains swooped that quiet Sunday morning, a man relives his past.
I am Takeo Yoshikawa. I was a man who spied on Pearl Harbor. Now I can tell my story. In those days, my English was very good. It had to be. Today, it is not so good. Since this is a difficult story, I'll tell it in Japanese.
I am 50 years old. I was born March 7, 1912, on Shikoku Island, the city of Matsuyama, southeast of Tokyo. I live there today. My father was a policeman. I was frail and weak as a young boy, but my father made me live a Spartan life. And by the time I was 11, I was strong and healthy. I could run well, I could swim 2 miles, and I was at the top in school. My ambition was to go to the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. And in 1929, I was admitted as a naval cadet. The Naval Academy was a hard, severe place. They emphasized the Bushido, the way of the warrior, the absolute loyalty of the warrior, the samurai. We were almost entirely isolated from the world. For 3 years and 8 months, we were there studying the military sciences. The physical training was very hard. There was swimming, at which I was very good, and there was the kendo, the Japanese stick fencing. I practiced this very hard. We young officers, the minds of young officers like me, were inclined towards the right-wing way of thinking. We were taught we should be ready to die at any moment. In spite of all the teaching, I always had a fear of death. I worked very hard at the academy. I was not cum laude in my studies, but I was able to get them done. My motto is study and concentrate. In 1933, I graduated. By now, I had decided that I could work for my country, even if I lost my life. I went to sea as an ensign aboard the old battleship Asama, and then the light cruiser Ura. That was in 1934. I was a code officer, and that helped me later at Pearl Harbor. We made a Mediterranean cruise, and I got a chance to go to Paris. We also visited Mussolini in Rome. When we got back to Japan, I was accepted for training as a naval aviator. I learned to handle the stick and throttle and to kick the rudder to turn the airplane. I thought this would help my professional advancement in the Navy. Then, one day, coming back from the flight line, I was stricken with severe abdominal pains. I was sent to the hospital, and in July 1935, back to my native city to recuperate. It was a great shock. My Navy career seemed to be finished. However, in 1936, a Navy captain came to see me. My health was much better. He said, "In this time of crisis, why aren't you working with us?" By then, all Japanese naval officers knew that we would someday fight the United States, and that it would be a naval war. The captain said there was a place for me in the Navy General Staff, 3rd Section, Intelligence. There would be no promotions for me. I told the captain I would do it. I was then only 25 years old. Since I had been studying English, I was assigned to the section dealing with the British and American navies. My specialty was the U.S. Pacific Fleet. I became the Japanese Navy's expert on the American Navy. I read everything: diplomatic reports from our naval attachés, secret reports from our agents around the world. I read military commentators like Hanson Baldwin in the New York Times. I read history too, like the works of Mahan, the famous American admiral. I studied Jane's fighting ships. I memorized the silhouettes of all the ships. That was very important to me later at Pearl Harbor. I read all the military journals, like the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. I was interested in American military thinking, strategic thinking. I always say, I am not a bright person, but I work very hard. One day in late 1940, my section chief called me and said, "How would you like to go to Honolulu and check the American Navy with your own eyes?" At first, I couldn't understand. Then he said, "You will have to let your hair grow long." At that time, I wore my hair short, like all military officers. But when you go abroad as a diplomat, you wear long hair. Now I knew. I would go into the Japanese consulate in Honolulu. I would see the American Navy with my own eyes and provide accurate information. He said, "Say yes or no," and I replied at once, "Yes, sir, I will go." I left Yokohama on March 20, 1941, aboard the Nita Maru. I never expected to return to Japan alive. I was deposed as a consular clerk in Honolulu, and I had a new name. I was not Takeo Yoshikawa. I was Tadashi Morimura. Since I had a new name, I had to change all my clothes, my shirts and shoes and suits. My name will appear here if I wear an old suit, and I will be discovered. On my luggage, I had to put the letter M. I told no one where I was going, not even my parents. We arrived in 1 week. On March 27, 1941, the Honolulu paper printed the announcement in the shipping news. As soon as I arrived, I went to the consulate, which is located, then as now, on Nuano Avenue. As I walk up to it today, as I walk through my past, I remember very well walking up to it that day in 1941. There is a new building now, otherwise it's the same. I remember walking inside and meeting the Consul General, Mr. Nagao Kita. He was short and fat, very pleasant and gay, although this day he was nervous. He knew all about my mission. I took out $600 from my inner pocket. That was all they gave me in Japan to handle the espionage in Hawaii. I showed the money to Mr. Kita. He told me to be careful. The FBI had been strengthened in Hawaii, and they were watching things very closely. But he would help. He would do what had to be done. From that day on, this was my headquarters. All of my messages would be sent from here in code to Tokyo. This became the center for Japanese espionage in Honolulu. I began my activities immediately. The same day I arrived, I began walking around the island. Since I am a newcomer to Hawaii, everything was new to me. Eventually, I would cover not only Oahu, but all the other islands too, pretending to be a sightseer. In Hawaii, there were more than 150,000 Japanese, 83,000 on Oahu alone, so it was not too conspicuous for me to travel around. The Japanese Americans never gave me any help. They were faithful and loyal to America. If there were any other agent from Japan at the time, I never saw them or knew anything about them. I worked strictly alone. The place I wanted to see most was Pearl Harbor. Every day I took a car or a taxi or a bus ride and passed through those places where I could observe it. I saw a great deal. It wasn't hard for me to see what I wanted to see. A simple thing like renting a plane at John Rogers Airport and taking a sightseeing tour. I did that all the time. And whenever possible, I made sure we flew over or near Pearl Harbor. And everything I saw, everything I heard, everything I deduced, I sent it all to Tokyo. A place I visited frequently was Pearl City, near Pearl Harbor. Every day I would make a point of walking through here to the end of the peninsula, where I could easily study the airstrip on Forward Island and Battleship Row. I remember this very spot. I used to walk out here carrying a fishing pole. It was a fine place to go fishing. And if anybody asked me, I would just tell them that I came for fishing and lost my way. The beaches of Oahu were especially important to me. I swam at practically all of the waterfronts, studying the tides, beach gradients, underwater obstructions, and the like. I became very familiar with these places. Tokyo was very interested in learning about anti-submarine and anti-torpedo nets, and I tried to investigate this. It was a dangerous thing to do. A lot of places were off limits, and I couldn't get in. I had to take chances. For almost a week, I covered Waikiki Beach. The sun burned my body totally black, and even the backs of my feet and my hands, arms and legs, became very burned. There were a lot of excellent places to go sightseeing. Aiea Heights, the fine hills beyond Pearl Harbor, and Tantalus Mountain above Honolulu, perfect places to watch the fleet. I observed ships coming in and going out. I knew them by silhouette. How many? Which way are they going? I never knew when I might be caught by the FBI. I hammered everything into my head. I never carried a note, a pencil, or a camera. No small bombs or secret documents the way you read in novels. Intelligence work requires a detailed mind, accuracy, and patience. It is not an adventure. It is hard work. Before very long, I could identify every ship in the harbor by one quick sight. One of the best places for me was a Japanese tea house called Shancho Row. It was in the heights of Alua, below Aiea, and had a good view of Pearl Harbor. It is still there today, only it is now called Natsunoya Tea House. The old Mama-san is still there too. And when I came back, she looked at me and said, "Morimura, Morimura, I thought you were dead. I remember you. You were a big drinker in those days." She thought I was a big drinker and liked to play around with the geishas. Sometimes I did drink a little too much, but most times I pretended to be drunk so I could stay there all night. I watched the lights from the boats, the searchlights from the ships and from the harbor. And from those things, I could guess what was happening out there. And then, early in the morning, I could see how many ships were leaving, what direction they were taking. I watched them sail out through the narrow channel. How long did it take them to leave? How quickly could they leave? Then I would hurry back to the consulate and tell Tokyo. I took some grave risks. Once, disguising myself as an unemployed Filipino, I got a job as a dishwasher at the Navy officers' mess hall. I remember, as I stand here now, that my idea was to enable me to eavesdrop on interesting conversations that I might hear. What I heard indicated to me very little, only that few, if any, American officers expected war. 1941 approached its end. On November 1st, a ship was due in Honolulu from Japan. It was the Taiyo Maru, and the Honolulu paper printed notice of her expected arrival in the shipping news. She came into the harbor and moored without incident. What the paper didn't print was that on board was the youngest lieutenant commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and that he was disguised as a ship's purser. His name was Suzuki, and today he is Vice Admiral Suguro Suzuki, the head of the Japanese Navy, or Self-Defense Force, as we call it.
When we arrived in Pearl Harbor, I could see a lot of ships and other interesting things. Consul General Kido came aboard. There was a list of 97 questions that I wanted answered. Kido gave these questions to a Mr. Yoshikawa, who was once an ensign in the Japanese Navy. I knew him quite well.
I began answering each question. They were written so small that I couldn't read them without using a magnifying glass.
On what day of the week would the most ships be in Pearl Harbor on normal occasions?
Sunday.
How many large seaplanes patrol from Pearl at dawn and sunset?
Morning and evening, about 10 both times. I can count them as they pass over the front lawn of the consulate at dawn and dusk.
Are there anti-submarine nets at the entrance of Pearl Harbor?
Maybe so, but I don't know the details.
Are the ships fully provided with supplies and ready for sea?
They are not ready for combat, loaded with normal supplies and provisions only.
Each week the fleet goes to sea. Where do they go? What do they do? Particularly aircraft carriers.
Mostly unknown. Conversations with American sailors provide little information. I can supply arrivals and departures, but destinations are difficult to find out.
We left Honolulu on November 5th, 1941, and arrived in Japan on November the 12th. I gave the information from Yoshikawa to the Imperial Japanese Navy. I boarded a ship which took me to Tankan Bay in the Kurile Island, where the task force destined to attack Pearl Harbor was gathered. I reported information in detail. I briefed all the pilots. I watched the task force leave for Pearl Harbor. There were 33 ships and 423 planes. The date was November 26, 1941.
Meanwhile, in Honolulu, the days moved on to December 5th, 1941. On Tokyo's orders, I began using a radio station to place lost and found messages. The station, of course, could not know what was going on. And I didn't know either that the Japanese task force was on its way, and that the messages were being picked up and decoded on the Akagi, flagship of the fleet, steaming toward Pearl Harbor. I placed this one. Lost German police dog with name Mayor 5, white reward. On the Akagi, this meant carrier left Pearl Harbor on 5th. Another message I placed, Chinese rug, almost new, for sale. This meant new heavy cruiser arriving. House to rent Waikiki meant shore leave as usual. On December 6, 1941, I hurried to a sugarcane field on the heights overlooking Pearl Harbor. I looked down at Pearl Harbor. Down there, I could see a great deal. There were many ships, and I could plot their positions and their distances and their locations in a detailed way. I tried to remember them. I remembered them. For 8 months, I had been sending a stream of coded cables to Tokyo, first once a week, then every 3 days. Now on orders every day. I knew the time was near, but I did not know when the attack would come. I just kept sending my messages. And these were some of the messages I sent. The usual schedule for departure and return of battleships is as follows. Ships leaving on Tuesday, return on Friday. Ships leaving on Friday, return on Saturday of the following week. All ships remain in port for about 1 week. The fleet normally returns to Pearl Harbor as soon as training maneuvers are completed. Battleships are often moored in pairs in Battleship Row. Torpedo attacks against inboard ships ineffectual. I think there is still a good chance for a surprise attack. In my opinion, the battleships do not have torpedo nets. This brings me to December 7th, 1941, 1:20 in the morning, my last message. It went as follows. Vessels moored in harbor, 9 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 seaplane tenders, 17 destroyers. All aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers have departed harbor. No indications of any changes in U.S. fleet or anything unusual. That is all. That's the situation. Now it was very early in the morning of December 7th, but I couldn't sleep. I tried to tune a shortwave radio, but I couldn't get anything. Finally, I went to sleep and slept through until the morning. At 7:40 a.m., I came to the dining room of the consulate. Papaya, toast, and eggs were on the breakfast table. Then suddenly, I heard a noise from the direction of Pearl Harbor. I thought it was thunder. I felt it in my stomach. Then I heard it again. Explosions, strong explosions. I ran out of the room. I went outside into the courtyard. I looked at the sky. I saw many, many airplanes flying through the clouds and smoke. And on the wings, I could see clearly the sun, the rising sun. I rushed into the house of the Consul General, and he was there. And he was listening to the shortwave radio. Too much noise outside. I couldn't hear anything. But I remembered the wind messages. Every morning at 8, we listen to the news on Radio Tokyo. If the announcer says twice, east wind rain, then it is war against the United States. West wind clear, then war against Britain, the Singapore attack. North wind cloudy, then war against Russia. This must be east wind rain, east wind rain. The Consul General, he only say, oh, this is war. Then the Consul General and I rush out in the courtyard again and look at the sky. We see airplanes flying through the smoke. We see dive bombing. We see high altitude bombing. Now it is war, war. And the Consul General and I, we hold hands. We hold hands tight. Buddy Morimura, he says, this is war, war. I have tears on my face. We gaze at the skies over Pearl Harbor, and that was the last day.
The smoke still